1. The case of Mary Hart. You had heard the stories as a kid, the tales parents whispered when they thought their children were asleep. It was meant to be a ghost story, a cautionary tale about venturing too far into the forest on the edge of town. But the story wasn't a figment of anyone's imagination. It was a true nightmare. This is what really happened. The setting was a small town nestled deep in the Appalachian Mountains, where dense forests seemed to stretch endlessly, and the fog hung low over the roads each morning. It was the kind of town where people still left their doors unlocked, and children roamed freely. But they all knew to stay away from the woods when the sun began to dip behind the trees. It was early September in the late 1980s, a time when the leaves were just starting to turn. In this sleepy town, the arrival of autumn was marked by the excitement of the annual county fair. Families gathered for games, food, and rides, and the whole community came together in a rare moment of celebration. That was where she was last seen. Mary Hart was a 15-year-old girl who lived on the outskirts of town. She was shy and studious, with a love for books and a quiet demeanor that made her the type of girl you'd overlook in a crowd. But she was known to wander into the woods, which stretched out just beyond her backyard. She would sometimes spend hours there, disappearing into the forest depths, saying she felt a strange connection to the place. One warm afternoon, Mary left for the fair, dressed in a blue sundress with flowers embroidered on the hem. She promised her mother she'd be back by dinner, but when evening came and the stars dotted the sky, Mary hadn't returned. Her parents were worried, of course, but they assumed she'd lost track of time. They thought she'd be home soon, perhaps with a tale about winning a prize at the fair or trying a strange new food. But Mary never came home. As the days turned into weeks, a sense of dread settled over the town. A massive search effort was launched, with police and volunteers scouring the woods and searching every inch of the fairgrounds. They put up flyers with Mary's picture and pleaded with anyone who might have seen her to come forward. People whispered about what could have happened, and every family clung tightly to their children. The woods, once a familiar and comforting place, took on an air of menace. Parents warned their kids never to venture beyond the edge of the trees. But as the days stretched into months, hope faded. The search was eventually called off, and Mary became a ghost in the town's memory. A story parents told their children to keep them close, to remind them of the dangers lurking in the shadows. The fairgrounds grew silent again, and the woods became a place no one wanted to visit. Then, nearly a year later, something was found. A hunter named James was deep in the woods, tracking deer, when he stumbled upon something that made his blood run cold. Nestled between the twisted roots of an ancient oak tree was a tattered blue sundress, faded and torn, but unmistakably Mary's. Scattered around it were small trinkets, a broken hairpin, a rusty locket, a shoe, caked with dirt. James dropped his rifle and backed away, his heart pounding in his chest. He ran back to town, desperate to tell someone, anyone, about what he had found. The police were called and the woods came alive with the sounds of dogs barking and search teams combing through the underbrush. They followed the trail, moving deeper into the forest, far beyond where anyone in town had ever dared to go. The trees grew thicker, the air colder, and a strange, almost tangible sense of dread seemed to hang over the place. Finally, they came to a small clearing, where they found something even more horrifying. A shallow grave, hastily dug and partially covered with stones. Inside were the remains of a young girl, bones picked clean by the forest scavengers, a tangle of hair matted with dirt. They identified her by the remnants of her dress and a small silver ring on her finger, a gift from her mother on her 15th birthday. The town was shaken to its core. They had all hoped, in some corner of their hearts, that Mary might have simply run away, that she was out there somewhere, living a new life. But the discovery of her grave shattered that hope, replacing it with a grim reality. The police launched a full investigation, determined to find out what had happened to Mary. They interviewed everyone who had been at the fair that day, combed through records, and followed every lead, no matter how small. But no one had seen her leave the fairgrounds, and there was no evidence to suggest where she had gone. The only clue they had was a series of strange symbols carved into the trees near her grave. They were intricate, almost ritualistic, spirals and shapes that seemed to pulse with a dark energy. The locals began to whisper about old legends, tales of ancient beings that haunted the woods, spirits that demanded sacrifices to keep their power. Some said Mary had been taken by these spirits, offered up as a blood price to keep the town safe. But the truth was far more chilling. Years passed, and Mary's case faded from memory, becoming little more than a ghost story. But in 2003, nearly 20 years after Mary's disappearance, a man named Richard White was arrested on suspicion of multiple kidnappings and murders. Richard had been a drifter, moving from town to town, leaving a trail of young girls in his wake. His victims were always found in remote areas, their bodies marked with the same strange symbols that had been found near Mary's grave. Richard was a quiet man with a blank expression, his eyes cold and empty. When the police questioned him about Mary, he simply smiled and said, "She called to me." He claimed he had met her at the fair, lured her into the woods, and performed a ceremony to appease the spirits that haunted him. He described the symbols as ancient markings, meant to bind the souls of the young girls to the forest, to keep them trapped there forever. During his trial, Richard showed no remorse. He described his actions in chilling detail, as though he were recounting a mundane task. The townspeople watched in horror as he spoke, his voice flat and emotionless, his eyes never once showing a glimmer of guilt or regret. He was eventually convicted and sentenced to life in prison, but the damage had been done. The woods had claimed another soul, and the town was left to grapple with the terrible truth. Even now, some people say they can hear Mary's voice echoing through the trees on quiet nights. A soft, mournful whisper that drifts through the forest like a ghost. They say she's trapped there, bound by the symbols carved into the trees, her spirit forever tethered to the place where she died. Others claim to have seen her, a fleeting figure in a blue dress, moving through the woods like a shadow. To this day, no one ventures into those woods alone. The townspeople speak of Mary with a mixture of sorrow and fear, knowing that her story is more than just a ghostly legend. It's a chilling reminder of the darkness that can lurk in even the most familiar places. And every year, when the county fair returns, people remember Mary Hart, the girl who wandered too far into the shadows and never came back. But Mary's story is more than just a local legend. Richard White was a real man, and his crimes stretched far beyond this small town. He became known as the Woodsman, a serial killer who preyed on young girls, leaving a trail of symbols and shallow graves in his wake. His victims were scattered across multiple states, and it took years for the authorities to connect the dots. And Mary Hart, she was his first, a small town girl with dreams of something bigger, whose life was cut short by a man driven by a darkness no one could understand. Her story is a reminder that sometimes the scariest monsters are not the ones hiding in the shadows, but the ones walking among us, blending in, waiting for their next victim. If you enjoy these true crime stories, make sure to hit the subscribe button, as it helps me make more and better content.